Can you hear me down there? How do I sound? Can you hear me? How's that? Can you hear me?
Oh, a little bit.
I don't think the volume's on mine. I think it's... How's that? Huh.
Complete just nonsense, buzzing. This one, I can hear.
How does this sound now? Can you hear me okay now? How does this sound? Testing, testing. How's this sound? I'll be talking louder, like this.
I can hear it a little bit through here. This one is just buzzing.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Ray, are you using a remote to switch sides or just on the computer?
I'm just on the computer. Good evening.
Hi, Ray. How are you tonight?
Good. I thought I was adjusting the volume on it.
Well, that's great.
One of them is just buzzing.
Okay.
This one I could hear you.
Oh, okay.
So hopefully this is what we'll record, not this. You know?
I presume it records somehow through radio waves.
Oh, no, they might bring them.
Okay. Well, we'll just do the best we can.
Best we can.
The best we can, yep. Okay. Okay, I'm going to get started.
$19.59. I don't think it's Yes.
Some more doors.
Okay. Good evening, everybody.
Good evening.
Thank you for coming out tonight. I know there was a lot of questions about whether we were going to have this tonight or not. A lot of discussion went on today. It seems like it's escalating rapidly into you just don't meet anybody anywhere. We just felt that it's a small enough group and it's a short enough time that we'd go ahead and do it. If people are uncomfortable with coming, they wouldn't come. We provided sanitizer and hand wipes up at the front there. You're welcome to use those, please do. But we appreciate you coming out here tonight to join us. Been working on this talk for a little while and didn't want to see it just disappear away. And when I saw they were still doing the fish fry tomorrow night, I thought, well, if they're going to do the fish fry, I'm going to do this. I just found out that Crazy Cash was canceled, and the schools are canceled for 3 weeks starting next Monday. So glad we were able to squeak this in. I appreciate you coming tonight. Again, my name is Ray Berg. I'm the president of the Manchester Area Historical Society. And our just got a very brief business program here tonight. Our secretary couldn't come here, so we don't have minutes to report, but I don't think he came here to hear the minutes anyway, so pass on that. From a treasurer's point of view, I'll talk about the pay down the mortgage, which is the main part of our campaign currently. I'll talk about that in a few minutes. So I'll just go on basically to our brief updates, let you know what's going on. Our pay down the mortgage campaign is continuing very nicely. We are now down to $124,000 on the mortgage itself, and we have about $20,000 more in confirmed pledges, things that I know are coming. We still have a major grant request out there that we're waiting to hear on. But my goal really is to try to get us down to the $90,000 mark, which is halfway. The mortgage is halfway paid off. We're coming up on a negotiation with our mortgage bank shortly. We mortgaged the house here through Ann Arbor State Bank 4.5 years ago. They were very gracious about it. They were trying to come into the Ann Arbor area, and they granted a mortgage to us, a nonprofit, which is somewhat unusual. And it's worked out very well. We've been paying it down as much as we can over that period. And of course, our tenant upstairs, whose rent pays basically the fundamental mortgage payment each month, so things tend to balance out. That bank is merging now with a bank called Level 1 Bank out of Farmington Hills. So we got two things coming up. One is the merger of these two banks that will now hold our mortgage. And secondly, should we go ahead and renegotiate our mortgage now rather than waiting until December of 2020 when it comes due? Because interest rates on mortgages are down to about 3.5%. And our current rate's 5.25%. So we'd like to be able to go in there and say, let's renegotiate to a number that we feel comfortable with. Let's say $120,000, $110,000, whatever it is at the time, and get that lower interest rate locked in. Because we really don't know where the rates are going to go, but I can't see them going much lower than they are now. So the board authorized me to go ahead and talk to our bank about that, and our goal is again to come back and get another 5-year mortgage at a much lower interest rate, and hopefully by the time this current 5-year mortgage expires, we've got half the mortgage paid off. That's our goal right now. So I appreciate any help you can make with contributions, and again, we'll have a placard put up here in the hall listing all the pay down the mortgage donors and what's going on with that. We are also selling calendar sponsorships or friends ads for our 2021 calendar. Our calendar committee is now meeting. They're starting to put together the themes for the calendar, doing a lot of research, a lot of photography around town, and we would appreciate your interest in being a sponsor. There's different levels of sponsorship on the calendar. If you've looked at one, you can see there's all the way from business card up to full-page sponsorship. So I'd encourage you to consider a 2021 sponsorship. You can talk to Sue in the back here. When the meeting's done, she's part of our calendar committee, so she'll be glad to help you with that. Okay, our programs for April, May, and June. We've had some changes. So originally this month was supposed to be the Women's Ladies Society. The Manchester Ladies Society was going to do a presentation on the suffrage movement and the constitutional amendment that occurred 100 years ago in 1920. And they asked to delay. They're still doing some research. So we juggled things around a bit. We came up with this particular program that we'll do tonight because at our February meeting, it was a show and tell event when we bring in artifacts and talk about them. And a lot of people asked, you know, how do you go about researching the history of artifacts that you find? And this program, a form of it, was done about 10 years ago, wherever we were meeting at that time. And I was part of the program doing one for Freedom Township, a Freedom Township midden. And so we decided to redo that one because of the interest expressed last month and bring in not only rural middens, but urban middens here in Manchester. So that's what April is. The May program is going to be what was originally planned by Jennifer Nashiff. It's on the care and preservation of tombstones. She's been very active in working in Oak Grove Cemetery with some other people to clean up these tombstones that have lichen on them, all kinds of things growing on them, and clean them up. And when we did our cemetery tour of Oak Grove back in September, we showed some examples of tombstones that are very difficult to read because they're covered with all sorts of stuff. And she has become an expert in going out with environmentally free, non-hazardous chemicals that wash off all this growth on there and restore the tombstone back to brilliance. So she's got several examples of before and after of what we've been doing down in Oak Grove. and it's a process that's worked out very nicely. So that will be our April presentation. Then the May presentation will be the Women's Ladies Society, Manchester Ladies Society, doing the talk on the suffrage movement here in Manchester. And then our June will be our usual annual summer picnic, which Norma Avery has graciously and eagerly volunteered to do again. You're having a lot of work done at your place now by the Amish. Yeah, so she's eager to show off all the improvements and the additions to her museum. So thank you for hosting our picnic again in June. So that's what's going on for the rest of this year. Our board met last week. We talked about a variety of options for 2020-2021 programs. And we came up with a lot of ideas. And on our back table there, we listed some of the ideas. And it's a survey form we would like you to take if you're interested. We're asking you to indicate by a check mark any and all of these programs that you're interested in. I'm trying to get a sense of which ones that people really want to hear about so we can plan accordingly for next year. And then if you have other ideas that are not on here, things you'd like to hear about or see, please just jot them down on there. So on the back table with Karen, there's several of these forms if you didn't pick one up when you came in. And then take time to fill it out and leave it back there on the table. We'd appreciate your input on getting our programs together for next year. So then finally, Tim Polk and Kathleen Grady asked me to announce that on March 24 at the Clinton Historical Library, at the Clinton Library, they're going to be doing their podunk talk that they did, I guess it was last fall. Podunk is a little village south between Manchester and Clinton on the River Raisin. And the Clinton Historical Society is going to host them at the Clinton Library. So if you're interested, or if you missed it the first time around, want to hear that talk, they'll repeat it on March 24th at the Clinton Historical Library. So that, I think, is pretty much my brief updates. Any questions or things people want to add to what I have said? Okay. Okay, thank you. So we'll begin our program. We'll get going on that. We put together a slideshow. We called it Middens in Manchester. I'm pleased to be partnered up with Jamie Schmidt tonight. I'm doing kind of like the rural stuff, and she's doing in the village stuff. So it's interesting to see how these things developed over the years. And so the first question always is, what is a midden? Okay. So midden is a Scandinavian word that basically means a dunghill or refuse heap, trash heap. So we're not sure if it comes from the Middle European era midding, dunghill refuse heap, or if it comes from the Danish word miding, which again comes from muck and heap. Trash heaps, dumps. And of course, back in the old times, back in those medieval times, there were no sewers, there were no garbage pickup. People just threw it out. And a very interesting book about this, if you ever have time to read something of this size, is this book called The Source, James Missioner. So if you were reading novels like this back in the 70s and 80s, James Missioner was the guy. He wrote so many fantastic historic books. And this is probably my favorite of his, called The Source. And what this book is a group of archaeologists in Israel digging through a midden. In Israel, it's called a tell. They're digging through a tell. And over the years, garbage has packed up on the ground, and the cities in Israel basically have grown up with the trash mounds. They keep raising the elevation up. And what they do in this book is the archaeologists are digging down through a midden, and they find an artifact. And then, what is this? What was it used for? And then Missioner tells a whole story about the people who lived there at that time, and happy stuff, sad stuff, normal life. But it tells you in that story what that object is, how it got there in the tell. And it's a great book to read if you ever want to get deep into what are middens. So, just to give a few examples, Jamestown, Virginia is a classic excavation site in the U.S. On the right picture there is a food storage cellar where the people are excavating, finding all sorts of bottles, jars, all sorts of things down there. And then here's a medieval midden, digging down the ground. The soil in this particular location was anaerobic, so the bones didn't dissolve or rot away. They're all there. so they can dig down and find all sorts of things and learn about the culture of the people, the way they lived, what kind of things they threw away, and that sort of thing. And another example of Jamestown are wells that were dug, or privies that were dug, where they just started throwing things in. And here's one from Jamestown that shows all sorts of artifacts that were found in a well in Jamestown. This is back around the year 2000. They were really excavating this. And they're able to identify the object and date it and figure out exactly how old this well is and when it got abandoned in use. So this has been a topic that's always been a little bit interesting. We can have both urban middens and rural middens. Here's an urban midden. There's obviously some sort of major town. They're digging construction work for a freeway, and they're finding all sorts of stuff in the ground there, digging it up. Here's a rural midden, example of stuff that was thrown away on a farm. And we generally know now that pretty much any historic farm in this area has got a dump somewhere. If you walk around and look around, you can find the dump. And one place that I've been to before is James Madison's Montpelier estate in Virginia, and they were excavating in front of his estate there, part of a restoration program they had going on at Montpelier to find what kind of artifacts they could there. So that's what got us going. I'm going to talk first about my house. Karen and I live on Eisman Road. Eisman is the road that the Albert Cider Mill is on, so it runs north and south. We're between Austin and Bethel Church, and our property is this parcel here, and there is two tributaries of the River Raisin flowing through our property. This first tributary is coming through here on the south end of our property, and the north tributary is coming down here through a pond, and these two merge over on this side and then flow out to the River Raisin. When you have acreage like that, and you've got a farmhouse, you got to dump stuff somewhere. So what happens in this area right here is the tributary has carved out a canyon. So what you look for on the rural farms are canyons or some sort of depression that naturally existed that you can fill up. In our case, here's our property right down here in a map of Freedom Township. And so we use plat maps from the mid-1850s on to identify the owners who own the property. So in our case, in 1874, John Gumper owned it. And he's a fairly well-known guy in Freedom Township history. He's a German, which will become important here in a minute. And his house was actually up here in the corner of Faust and Eisman Road, home now owned by Phyllis Marinuk and Mike Golka, if you know them. Tom Golka. And so they would walk down across the acreage on the south side of Faust Road and dump the stuff down the canyon. So here's the canyon. This is what you see from Eisman Road looking into the east. River Creek is running through here. This thing was clearly obvious when we bought the place. Some sort of a big metal box that somebody threw down the canyon years ago. And if you walk up and down this canyon, especially this time of year, early March, when the snow is gone, the sun is shining, and there's no foliage yet, you walk through that canyon, you'll see things glinting all over the place. And in our particular canyon on this piece here, there's at least 8 middens. Most of them come down from my property side, but there's a couple that come down from this property side over here. And some of them are down at the bottom of the canyon, some are midway, some are at the top. And just kind of fascinating. I had never experienced this before, so the first time I go out there, start looking around, what's going on out here? And it's a great thing to do. It's fun to do. We've probably looked at about 1% of all the stuff that's out there. I mean, there's just tons of stuff out there. And my grandkids love it now. They love going down in there and digging around all the old bottles and the glass and so on. Here's a view. This is again the canyon. Looking up, here's where our house is. So it's a fairly steep canyon. So when things are thrown off the side, over time, the stuff would roll down the canyon, slide down the canyon. So typically the oldest things that exist are at the bottom of the canyon, down here, or they're at the lowest level at a top midden. stuff's been put on top and it kind of stayed there. So I've learned to kind of dig down through these Middens and come down here at the bottom and find out what finally rolled out at the very bottom there. So here's what one typically looks like. There's metal, there's glass. The labels, the paper labels have all rotted off. They're gone. So you just got glass down there. If you're lucky, they've stayed intact. You know, the glass parts have stayed intact. And trees have fallen down on them and all sorts of stuff. But this is just one of maybe 10 or 15 that exist along this piece here. And it's just fun to go in there and start poking around. So, this thing. So here's this big piece of metal down there. Fortunately, it had a tag on it. So you come up close with the iPhone there, take a little picture of the tag, Google the tag. And it turns out to be this thing. It's an Apple evaporator freezer unit. Okay. I found the exact name, the exact model, Googled it. Sure enough, here's a picture from the 1940s of a unit in operation. And obviously it came from the cider mill. They were collecting apples or storing them in this refrigerator to cool them or whatever. And apparently one day they didn't want it anymore or broke or whatever, so I probably put it in the back of a 1940s truck or something like that. Went down there, down the canyon, and it sits there now to this day, 80 years later. So it's kind of fun to do the research. The idea is you find the object, get whatever you can from the object, whether it's just lettering on the glass or whatever, and see what you can find out about it. So I'll start with this one. I brought this in before, and what I like about it, of course, is that the cap stayed intact and the original stuff is still in there. Well, it's covered with embossed lettering. Thomas's Eclectic Oil. Thomas's Eclectic Oil. Oh, internal and external. Foster Milburn Company. Okay, so just go ahead and use Google, figure it all out, and because it's Thomas's Eclectic Oil, because you'll also see electric oil, you'll see electric oil, you'll see all kinds of variations of the name, but this one's Eclectic Oil, and it's Foster Milburn Company. It allows you to narrow down. This is from the 1880s. It allowed you, the Foster Milburn Company manufactured eclectic oil in about a 20-year range. So I guess it was about 1880. Still intact. Okay? So you Google that. Here it is. Okay, so this particular picture is from 1905. Here they're calling it Eclectic Oil, Dr. Thomas's. Okay, 10 cents. Foster Milburn Company of Buffalo, New York. That all fits. So this is an actual, somebody's got one preserved of what that bottle is there. Okay, and it's hard to read, but you can read the ingredients.
Does it treat everything? Is that what?
Yes. So I'll show you in a minute here. When it was first manufactured in the 1840s, its primary ingredient was opium. It had alcohol in it. Cure everything. But over the years, like Foster and Milburn, different companies, they began to migrate away from opium, and they started going into all sorts of components. Here it's called electric oil. So the name kind of varied over the years. It kept moving around a bit. But it was formulated by Dr. S.N. Thomas in the 1840s. And so I was glad to find an actual case and bottle of what I actually had, and dated mine to 1880s. Okay, so what does it do? Cures toothache, earache, backache, coughs, hoarseness, cold, sore throat, deafness. It cures deafness.
I need that.
Pain of burn, pain of scald. Okay, now this is a little bit later in life. I mean, in earlier days, they were promoting it cured tuberculosis, it cured all sorts of things. This is one where they actually had the formulation. So this is later on, probably around 1900, 1910, turpentine, camphor, oil of tar, red thyme, and fish oil. That's what made that up. And you can still buy this. It's still sold in Ontario. I found a website for the Northrop Scott Incorporated in Belleville, Ontario. You can buy it. It's a registered trademark. A liniment for the treatment of coughs, colds, bruises, sprains, strains. So they kind of narrowed down what it will cure. But you can still buy this. You can still buy it. And like I say, the name has varied over time, but that to me, that's my prize thing that given the date, 1880s, John Gumper bought this. He must have taken a swig of it and said, oh, that's just terrible. Put the cap back on, out it goes. And fortunately, rolling down the hill and hitting rocks and stuff, it didn't break. Worked out good. Okay, just want to show this. This is a fairly famous picture of downtown Manchester. The pharmacy building was a pharmacy back in the 1880s. Okay, and at that time it was George Heisler and John Hampton Kingsley owned the business. So here's John Kingsley right there. That is the only picture that we have of John Kingsley as a young man. We're still trying to find pictures of John Kingsley as a young man. I've asked family members. His granddaughters have come and visited us here at the KJ house a couple of times. I've asked, do you have any pictures of your grandpa? No. He was grumpy grandpa. We never got any pictures from him. But there he is. But the key thing is here on this little post out front, Thomas's Eclectic Oil. He's advertising it right here, Thomas's Eclectic Oil. So our John Hampton Kingsley is selling Dr. Thomas's Eclectic Oil in the Heisler and Kingsley pharmacy. So that's when these two men operated together. It's the 1870s, roughly 1880. George Heisler and John Kingsley, and George Heisler's son married John Kingsley's daughter. So the families kind of came together, but they didn't stay as partners for a long time. But I just like the fact that he's selling the product that John Gumper bought at Don't Like This Down the Canyon kind of thing. Here's our next thing. I brought this one last time also. This is sort of a simple looking bottle, still got a cap on it, but no contents. A. Overholt Company, and as I mentioned last time, it's the Abraham Overholt Distillery. And so here he is, nice kind of grumpy looking guy, and he is a Mennonite. So this is a Mennonite distillery in Pennsylvania, and became quite famous. It was President Lincoln's favorite drink, Overholt whiskey. We did find that as a fact. And so he ran this distillery in Pennsylvania, and like I say, it was a Mennonite distillery. He was clearly selling outside the Mennonite community, and when Prohibition came, the U.S. government came into his distillery and said, shut down, and he said, no, we are Mennonites. We brew this for our church members for medicinal purposes, for use by our members. You can't tell us what to do in our church. And the federal government says, oh yes we can, and all the way up to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court did decide that U.S. law trumped Mennonite church law. And so churches could not claim exemption from prohibition based upon their religious beliefs. And so the Mennonite did shut down. However, what I find interesting is that even though it's a Mennonite brew made for Mennonites, how did this end up in my canyon? Okay, how to get all the way over here to John Gumper drinking this stuff. And turns out there was quite a rum running operation going on from Pennsylvania through Ontario, through Detroit, back out to Freedom Township. So yes, it wasn't quite all sold to Mennonites after all. Here's what the bottle looks like with its label on it and everything. And that's what the distillery looks like today, kind of a ruins. It turns out that his site was also connected with the development of the coke and steel business in Pittsburgh. He became pretty good friends with the Mellon and the Fricks. And now
This is a chef fruit jar from a company called Berdan & Co. It was actually out of Toledo, Ohio, so it wasn't that far. This guy came, Berdan & Co. started working, let me get my notes. They really started to pump things out in the 1850s up until 1930s. This is a really good example of folks who had money to buy already canned stuff. Whereas if you look on the flip side, and a lot more houses will have things like this. This guy is from a base, from a ball jar. It's really boring in nature. A lot of the really earlier finds in the country, as well as some in the city, you're going to see more things like ball jars. The reason why is because they were cheaper to buy, and it was cheaper to eat stuff that was in season or to can it yourself. You can tell that this is early because Ball stopped using this ball blue color. They used to get the sand from a very specific location in Michigan City, Indiana. It was called Hoosier Slide, I think. And they used up all of the sand. The blue actually comes from the chemical composition of the sand at the location. But when it was gone, it was gone. So now, unless it's a reproduction, you can kind of grasp what era some of the broken glass and that kind of stuff comes from on your hill. They survive all that well in the ground. This is an example of somebody's socioeconomic status of the people who used to live in the property. I actually have here several pieces. A young lady living in our house by the name of Sarah Janes, who was a school teacher, and she apparently had very nice taste in some of the things that she had. So there's that. So after about World This guy right here. So what this is you don't need the magnet. This piece right here, it actually has a lot of letters. These days it would cost you about $112 to be able to make ice cream. At that point, either Miss Sarah Jane's liked to have her ice cream on a nightly basis, or in, I think it was 1950. Thing that we want to take into consideration in all of the fun things that we find are not just the socioeconomic or the consumer habits, but actually pertain to the functionality of the home. For example, this really ugly looking thing. Now, there are other things you might find. For example, hinges off of your house. You may also find things like doorknobs, other various hardware things. So this guy is a clinker, and what this tells us, this very ugly, poopish looking thing, it actually has glints in it from the silica. If a house has coal furnaces, coal parlor stoves, boilers, anything, this is a byproduct of coal. So essentially it's all of the jazz that doesn't burn up, it gathers in the bottom of the system. And folks would chip it out and they would shovel it and they would throw it down the hill. Namely because it has no value. It's trash. The cool stuff about this is that, so for example, in the Netherlands, they actually would create bricks out of using this clinker stuff. Or way back in the day, they would actually take it, they would break it into little tiny pieces, and they would use it for paving roads, just because it is a really strong material, and it does have a purpose in that. But in our